Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Old Theatre at the London School of Economics and Political Science for this hybrid event. My name is Emma McCoy, and I am the Vice President and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Education here at LSE. I am immensely pleased to be here to welcome our online audience, our live audience, and our speaker this afternoon, the First Minister of Scotland, the Right Honourable Humza Yousaf, who will be arguing the merits of an economic and social model for Scotland inspired by the EU and its member states. Today's event is hosted by LSE's European Institute, a multidisciplinary centre for the study of European politics, economics and culture in a globalised world. Our European Institute participates in the public debate on important ideas through their research and by convening events with leading figures such as this one. As usual, there will be the chance for you to put your questions to our speaker. And for our online audience, you can submit your questions via the Q&A box on your screen. Questions will be screened by staff from the European Institute. Please do let us know your name and affiliation when asking your question. We are particularly keen to hear from our students and our alumni. For those of you here in the theatre, Professor Begg will let you know when we will open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand, and when called upon, kindly give us your name and affiliation before posing one short question so that we can get through as many questions as possible. And he will try to ensure a range of questions from both online and our audience here in the theatre. For those ex-users following the conversation, the hashtag for today's event is LSE Scotland, capitals LSE and S, of course. And this event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I am pleased to introduce our speakers. Humza Yousaf was appointed as First Minister of Scotland in March of last year, so coming up to a year, assuming that role immediately after being elected leader of his Scottish National Party, which currently holds a plurality of seats in the Scottish Parliament and has led the devolved Scottish Government since 2007. Born, raised and educated in Scotland, he was first elected to the Scottish Parliament to represent that city in 2011 and has served in a variety of government posts, including Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care. Ian Begg is a professorial research fellow at LSE's European Institute. His main research work is on the political economy of European integration and EU economic governance. And he has published and spoken widely on the subject that we will be discussing today. So with no further ado, I will now turn the lectern over to the First Minister. Thank you very much. And thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Professor McCoy, for such a kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be hosted by LSE's European Institute, which I gather is the largest centre for the study of Europe anywhere in the world. And talking to you when I came in, you told me that you're from St Andrews, or just outside of St Andrews. So I'm sure you will indulge me when I say that although LSE is a world-class institution, of that there's no doubt, ranked 4th in the Guardian's Best UK Universities 2024, the university that is ranked top is in Scotland, your hometown, of course, of St Andrews. Professor Begg, of course, a Scot as well, from the Kingdom of Fife, from what I gather, as well. So it just reminds me of that famous saying, of course, that there are two types of people in the world, Scots and those who want to be Scottish. There is a third, of course, those who lack any ambition whatsoever, but we shall look over those individuals. It is a real pleasure to be here. It is the UK's relations with Europe and Brexit, of course, which in many respects will form the backdrop of my remarks today. But I will start with another B word, if I may, not that one, but the word budget. It is the Scottish Government's view that the UK Government's budget is one that sacrifices public services such as the NHS to the expense in favour of unsustainable tax cuts. The NHS unarguably our most precious institution. The NHS, which political leaders stood on their doorsteps and applauded, and which political leaders in the UK government promised to give their support to during that institution's hour of need. But instead of investing in our public services, what we have seen from both the autumn statement and the most recent spring statement is tax cuts worth around about £1,500 if you take both statements together. Tax cuts of around £1,500 for those on an MP's salary at the expense of investing in public services. That, to me, is a demonstration of the wrong priorities. In its coverage, the Financial Times warned of a brutal fiscal reckoning for whoever forms the next UK government. The current UK government has now held two so-called major fiscal events in the space of just a few months. To have two such events so close together does not, to put it mildly, seem like a sensible way of running an economy or providing stability for business or indeed for industry. So businesses, individuals, indeed devolved governments shouldn't be subject to such a volatile environment. But these events are damaging in a more fundamental way. The speculation and then reaction around changes to tax in particular mask a deep-rooted, or indeed to mix my metaphors, a hardwired problem with the UK economic model. Ed Balls, the former Labour Cabinet Minister, advisor to Gordon Brown, who's now joining an ever-increasing list of podcast hosts. As an aside, if only we could grow the economy at the same speed as the ever-growing list of middle-aged men that are hosting podcasts, we'd be on to a real winner, but let's put that to the side for a second. Ed Ball, he summed up the key issue recently when he wrote and asked the question, why doesn't the British economy grow anymore? That's the exam question. Why does the UK economy not grow anymore? When he was still in frontline politics, Ed Balls delivered what was quite an erudite, celebrated speech, warning about the austerity path that his opposite number, and now, of course, his podcast partner, George Osborne, had set the UK on. The policy direction, he said, was wrong. He described it as reckless, and he described it as dangerous. And he was, of course, correct. And we are still living with the disastrous consequences of those cuts today. That speech was delivered in front of an audience at Bloomberg. A few years afterwards, Bloomberg then hosted another senior politician for a major speech. That politician was the then Prime Minister, now Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, when he promised a referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union. The words wrong, reckless and dangerous come back to mind. Brexit and austerity seem like pretty good candidates in terms of the answer to Ed Ball's question on why the UK economy doesn't grow anymore. But it is my contention that the problems with the UK economy go much further, much deeper than the recent poor, catastrophically poor, decisions such as leaving the EU. So today I will outline the characteristics of what for far too many people is a failed and failing UK economy. I'll set out why, regardless of the result of the next UK election, the failure is likely to continue because of this really damaging, cosy Westminster consensus that refuses to take a different path, despite all of the evidence that is in front of us. And before that sounds too gloomy, nobody wants a gloomy Scot by any stretch, I will also try to make the case for what I think is a better, more optimistic future. For Scotland, yes, but also the positive impact that could have on the rest of the UK. That, after all, is surely what political leadership should be about. It should be about building the better future for the people that we serve. It's why I believe, in what will not certainly be headline grabbing or surprise to anybody, why independence is so important. Why independence is important for Scotland. Why it is the path that will deliver a better future, not just for the people of Scotland, but I also believe will have impacts for the rest of the UK. Sadly, when I look at the two main Westminster parties, that basic goal that should be at the heart of every political leader's priorities, that basic goal of improving people's lives and of a better future, well, that priority seems to be posted missing. Instead, we have a Conservative government, a Tory party, that shamefully seems intent on fighting the next UK election as a divisive culture war. A complete and utter scorched earth policy from a party that knows it's on its way out of power. Labour, meanwhile, is purposely dialling down expectation on what can be achieved. Their offer amounts to no more than managing decline, but just doing that in a slightly more competent way than the Conservatives. It is, to me, a real tragedy that Labour, who are by every opinion polls measure miles ahead of the Conservatives, lack any vision. If ever there was a time to be bold, if ever there was a time to present a radical policy proposition, then surely that time is now. So let me turn to the first point. I'd like to cover the failure of that UK economic model, which, as I described already, is hardwired. As I say, the UK economy is characterised by low growth. We know that. It fell into recession last year. Real wages have been stagnant. Inequality is far too high. Productivity growth, the key driver of living standards, has been poor. Business investment is low. Public capital investment has also been both low and, indeed, volatile. And as so many have highlighted, the UK displays a remarkable, persistent level of geographical inequality with an unhealthy and unstable reliance on this wonderful city, but on the City of London. This all supports the conclusion of analysis that had been published in the Financial Times, which describes the UK as a poor society with pockets of rich people. It's even been argued the UK economic performance has been so poor it is now completely decoupled from the economic development path of other wealthy comparator countries. Indeed, the Shadow Chancellor has said she will inherit the worst economic conditions of any incoming UK government since the Second World War. And as an aside, I have to say that is a far cry from the future that was promised to Scotland by those who opposed independence in 2014. Back then, it was the alleged strength of the UK economy that was trumpeted at the time. 10 years on, a decade later, and that talk instead from those very same people is of complete UK economic catastrophe and carnage. So the problem is this: a UK economy that has failed the very people that it's meant to support. So what then about the solution? And that's where my view, and it's the view that is shared now by many others, is that Westminster-based parties' response to the problem falls woefully short. So if we accept the analysis that this is the worst economic situation and conditions since the Second World War, we might expect a serious, transformative, radical, bold policy proposition in response. But despite some fierce political rhetoric, what we have now, even in the face of such dire economic diagnosis, is in effect a Westminster no-change consensus. And consensus and consistency are usually good for business. In theory, they provide stability, but not if that consensus is taking the country in the completely wrong direction. Keeping on a steady course to hit the iceberg isn't exactly the way to provide stability. There is also, I believe, a consensus north of the border, but it's a very different one to that which we see in Westminster. That means that we have two fundamentally different futures on offer to the people in Scotland. And that in turn begs the question, who should decide that future? Should it be decided by people in Scotland or by the UK government at Westminster? So let me compare the propositions. Let me compare the Westminster no-change consensus with the change agenda that I believe the most people in Scotland will favour. Amongst Westminster-based parties, there is a consensus that the UK should stay both out of the EU and the huge European single market, whatever the cost. The National Institute for Economic and Social Research suggests that compared to EU membership, the UK economy was 2.5% smaller in 2023 and expects that figure to rise to 5.7% in a little more than 10 years' time. That means 69 billion could have been wiped from national income in 2023. That equates to around about £28 billion in tax revenue, a population share for Scotland of 2.3 billion, and around 60% of spending in Scotland is on devolved services. So if you take the same level of borrowing, same level of taxation, that means without Brexit, devolved spending power for vital public services such as the NHS could have been £1.6 billion higher in Scotland than it is today. So in other words, we have suffered, our institutions have suffered, our public services have suffered, and ultimately our people have suffered to the tune of £1.6 billion that could have been invested in Scottish public services because of a Brexit that, remember, Scotland overwhelmingly rejected. So looking to the future, the Office for Budget Responsibility says that the UK's potential GDP is expected to fall by 4% in the long run because of Brexit. As Professor Anton Muscatelli, he's an economist and also the principal of the University of Glasgow, said such a GDP reduction has a massive impact on either funding public services or cutting taxes, depending on your political inclination. So in Scotland, in contrast with the view at Westminster, I believe that there's a broad agreement that Brexit has damaged the economy, damaged public services, and that it should be reversed. But the difference between Westminster and the Scottish consensus goes much further than Brexit. At Westminster, there appears to be an agreement that public investment will have to fall as a percentage of national income over the next Parliament. The Scottish Government wants to increase our public investment. Of course, increasing public investment can also help to stimulate the economy, whether that's in capital infrastructure, which of course creates jobs, or investing in free childcare, which helps parents, especially women, to get back into work. At Westminster, there feels there's no appetite, no urgency, no great desire to tackle inequality, which is so entrenched within our society. There is agreement, for example, that the two-child cap should continue. In Scotland, we want it scrapped. If it was scrapped, this one measure alone is estimated to lift 250,000 children out of poverty. 250,000 children lifted out of poverty across the UK virtually overnight if one policy change was made. At Westminster, there is an agreement, a cosy consensus, that tax rates on high earners should not be raised to help to pay for public services. Now in Scotland, we've put in place a more progressive tax system, which unashamedly asks those who earn more to pay more to invest in public services. And in a highly symbolic but instructive move, there now seems to be agreement, again, a consensus between Conservative and Labour, that the cap in bankers' bonuses should be lifted. So no lifting on the two-child cap, but a lifting on the cap on bankers' bonuses. Don't tell me Westminster doesn't have the wrong priorities for Scotland, and I would suggest even for people right across the UK. Because of this no-change, cosy Westminster consensus, the UK is therefore destined to remain on a low-growth, low-productivity, low-living standard, high-inequality economy with an over-concentration of its wealth in this fine city that I'm speaking to you today. So now you'll be pleased to know for the optimistic bit, and I did promise you it's coming, what we can do in Scotland and what that can mean for the rest of the UK. And there is indeed grounds for optimism, in fact, grounds for real hope. And the first thing to say is this: given the state of the UK economy and the impact on living standards, the economic argument in favour for independence in my lifetime, I have to say, has never been stronger. It is my duty, of course, as First Minister, to lead a government that's dedicated to improving the lives of people in Scotland, to set out what is a better future. Because if we don't win this argument, people in Scotland will be locked, trapped more tightly into that failed Brexit-based economic model. So winning the argument for independence and achieving independence for me is more essential, more urgent than ever before. And at the heart of this argument is the very idea that in Scotland, decisions about Scotland should be made by those who live in Scotland. At present, it is Westminster that controls the macroeconomic policy. It controls migration, it controls employment policy, it controls competition policy. It controls most business taxation, a number of social security powers, trade policy, borrowing powers, our former relationship with the European Union, and a range of other policy interventions that drive economic outcomes. So it's therefore absolutely inevitable that with so much of the Scottish economy under control of the UK government, that growth in Scotland will tend to follow growth in the UK as a whole. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't or can't do nothing. We do act. In fact, it means we have to work that bit harder, that bit smarter, with the limited powers that we have. And we have made a difference. Since 2007, when my party first came into power, GDP per person has grown by 10.8% in Scotland. That's compared to 5.6% in the UK. Productivity, while still not growing at the rate we'd like, has grown at an annual average rate of 1% a year compared with the UK government's 0.5% a year. Just yesterday, a key survey showed that private sector employment growth in Scotland last month was faster than any other region and nation in the UK. And as a country, we've got many advantages: extraordinary energy resources, world-class universities, a thriving food and drink industry, a great tourism offer, and we are leaders in areas such as small satellite building, industries of the future. And I could spend all afternoon, hours in fact, talking up where Scotland has economic advantages that are unique, perhaps, to Scotland, certainly in a UK context. But there's one area that I was very keen to concentrate on, in particular, a success story that I'm very keen is heard here in London, right across Europe, the United States and elsewhere. And that success that we're driving forward with is new high-growth tech firms. Companies such as Blackford Analysis, which uses the power of artificial intelligence to improve patient outcomes. Intelligence Growth Solutions, a company whose approach to precision farming is at the very forefront of the push to deliver global food security. Through our TechScaler network of startup incubators, we're well on our way to delivering one of the finest state-funded systems in Europe dedicated to entrepreneurialism and dedicated to the creation of high-growth businesses. The programme is a game-changer for our startup community, and it's rapidly accumulated over 500 member companies. We've just opened our first TechScaler hub in Silicon Valley to help promising startups from Scotland build contacts with international investors and customers. And there's a key point here that I want to stress. The exceptional entrepreneurial activity taking place in Scotland, backed by Scottish Government funding, is happening alongside, hand in glove, I would suggest, with a commitment to building a fairer society. To me, they are two sides of the same coin. So just as we put money into encouraging high-growth tech firms, we're also investing substantially in interventions like the Scottish Child Payment, £25 per week per child for eligible families to help them out of poverty, and that's going to be increasing in just a few weeks' time. And as well as ensuring children in Scotland have opportunity, the child payment is also a hard economic policy, boosting spending power in local communities. So our approach is about encouraging economic dynamism alongside social solidarity. But none of this should obscure the reality of our position as part of that Westminster consensus on the economy. This can clearly be seen by the stark gap between the performance of the UK economy, which, as I said, Scotland tends to mirror, and the performance of independent European nations that are comparable to Scotland. If Scotland became even a little bit more normal in terms of living standards, again in comparison to other countries of our size, then the gains could be substantial. One of the strangest aspects of the political and economic debate in Scotland is that opponents of independence seem completely uninterested in how we might reach that kind of normal economic performance. We're told all the time that it's just mere fantasy, but it's never adequately explained why. Why is it a fantasy for an independent Scotland to achieve the levels of living standard that countries like ours simply take for granted? The economist David Skilling has written extensively about the reasons for the remarkable success of small, advanced economies. Among them are strong political institutions supported by high levels of trust in decision-making. They're flexible, they demonstrate high levels of international competitiveness, they tend to invest heavily in the future, from infrastructure to research and development. So there are general lessons, many of which we're trying to follow. In the case of one of those countries, Ireland, there's a particular lesson for Scotland. The Irish economic historian, Professor Kevin O'Rourke, cites various factors for Ireland's dramatically improved economic performance from around the 1990s. Underpinning everything, he says, was two crucial factors. Our political independence, which allowed us to adopt a policy mix that's well suited to our own circumstances, but also, crucially, our membership of the European single market, without which none of this would have worked. So in this analysis, the policy flexibility of independence and of EU membership were key to Ireland's takeoff. And the more Ireland diversified its trade, opened up to capital inflows, the wealthier it has become. So for those who argue that decisions about Scotland's economy are best made by the UK, the evidence just doesn't stack up. The Scottish Government is therefore currently setting out our economic plan and an independent Scotland in a series of speeches and papers that we're calling the Building a New Scotland series. We're keen to engage the widest possible debate, and we've set out our proposals, for example, to rejoin the European Union. We've demonstrated how EU policy and aspirations would benefit from Scotland's renewable power and energy and our carbon capture potential. An independent Scotland will have access to oil revenues, full borrowing powers, and we've used those to set up a special fund, the Building a New Scotland Fund, to boost infrastructure, to boost renewable energy projects, housing and other infrastructure projects that are vital to economic growth. Imagine we had the powers of migration. We could set up a system that's tailored to Scotland's distinctive needs. The migration system of the UK is one of the most self-harming policies that I have seen over the years. So in short, while the Westminster Consensus is seeking to ensure a hostile environment for the UK, we want to attract more skilled migration to Scotland to help fill the vacancies in both the public and the private sector. So, for example, as part of a new comprehensive welcoming system, we would introduce a new 5-year Scottish Connections visa for graduating international students. We would remove the minimum income requirement for family migration. And as part of the European Union, we would, of course, once again benefit from that freedom of movement right across the European Union. We could use employment powers to help to reduce the inequality which the OECD and others argue can drag down growth. So we would also be able to abolish anti-trade union legislation and develop a national action plan for collective bargaining right across the country. Soon we will be able to set out further proposals on encouraging more entrepreneurs to do business in Scotland as well. A crucial aspect to all of this is an idea that isn't particularly headline-grabbing, but is building stable, long-standing institutions and government departments that can drive that new Scottish economy. Ultimately, whether we succeed as an independent country or not will be determined by the decisions we take and the hard work and the talent of our people, just like any other country. For the UK too, there will be positive benefits from a Scottish vote on independence. We'll always be the closest of friends and the strongest of allies. We have that social union, that cultural union that we will always enjoy and that will always be familiar to each of our peoples. But we'll also enjoy a better political relationship, one that's based on a partnership, but a partnership of equals. In the context of the economy, I've described the damaging consensus which is taking both Scotland and the UK in the wrong direction. In Scotland, if Scotland were to become independent, that would be precisely the kind of jolt that's needed for a serious examination of the prevailing Brexit-based damaging consensus that is being pursued by Westminster at such a cost. To end, Professor Begg, people are crying out for hope. They need political leadership that offers an alternative to the absolute abject misery that they have endured, not because of anything that they have done, but because of decades of economic mismanagement. 14 years of austerity, Brexit, and a cost of living crisis that they didn't contribute to. They need political leadership that offers that alternative. I believe that my party can demonstrate that, can offer that change, with a bold policy platform that says economic dynamism and social solidarity absolutely go hand in hand. If we do that, then we can create that growing, fairer, greener economy that will ensure greater prosperity for all of our people. Thank you very much. So, thank you for your indulgence. I will take a couple of questions. I think there's a couple of broadcasters here, and then I'll sit back down and we'll take questions from the floor, which Professor Begg will chair. But I believe we've got Georgia Roberts here from the BBC. Georgia wants to ask a question, then I'll go to Paris from STV.
Sure, okay, thank you very much. First Minister, can I ask you about recent events? You're in London today where a major Conservative donor is facing allegations of racism after comments came to light about the former Labour MP Diane Abbott. The Guardian reported that he said, you see Diane Abbott on the TV and you just want to hate all black women because she's there. And I don't hate all black women at all, but I think she should be shot. You were also at the weekend talking about Islamophobic smears. You said there were smears after comments by a Conservative MSP. Do you think that the Conservative Party is institutionally racist? Do you think it's Islamophobic, both in the UK and in Scotland? And should the Conservatives return the money donated by Frank Hester? Thank you.
First and foremost, can I say that I stand in full solidarity with Diane Abbott. She has been a trailblazer for many years. We may have our differences on particular issues, but I stand full square behind and alongside Diane Abbott. Those comments from Hester are not just racist, they're not just sexist, they are inciting hatred, which is completely and utterly unacceptable. And if the Conservative Party had any moral principle, then they would return every single penny and tell him where his money should go. That is my honest view, and my honest view on the question of the Conservative Party more generally is that there is simply no doubt in my mind that the Conservative Party is not just riddled with Islamophobia, but institutionally Islamophobic. How can it not be when you hear the comments from Suella Braverman, when Lee Anderson, who was a senior member of the Conservative Party up to a few days ago, was able to make the comments that he made about Sadiq Khan, and not a single senior Conservative, including the Prime Minister, was able to call it Islamophobic. And that is, of course, the party who also elected a leader that described Muslim women as bank robbers because of the way that they look. So the Conservative Party, in my mind, undoubtedly is institutionally Islamophobic. Paris.
Thank you, First Minister. Figures out today have shown that drugs deaths in Scotland are rising again. They're up by 10% year on year. Is the Scottish Government's drugs policy failing, and do you regret the freeze and the downward pressure on alcohol and drug partnership funding in previous years?
So first and foremost, can I offer my condolences to every single family that's been impacted and affected by a drugs death. But can I also acknowledge that they don't just want sympathies and condolences or warm words, that they want to see action. And that's why I've continued, as my predecessor had first instigated, that funding, that additional funding for the national mission to tackle drugs deaths. These figures, that are suspected drugs figures, obviously we'll get the official figures later in the year. They are deeply concerning, they are deeply worrying. But that's why we'll work right across parties, Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat, Greens, work with whoever we need to work with in order to provide additional residential rehab, for example, to make sure that we get same-day treatment for those that are suffering substance abuse. I won't go back into funding decisions that were made many years ago, but what I am committed to do is increasing the funding. But I want to acknowledge that these figures are deeply distressing, concerning, worrying, but I give an absolute assurance to everybody that has an interest in this issue that we will not waver from our commitment to tackle drugs deaths in Scotland, which are far too high. Thanks very much. I'll take a seat and I'm happy to take questions.
Right. Thank you, First Minister, for, shall we say, a persuasive speech in favour of independence, maybe also of reintegrating in Europe. The way we're going to conduct this is I'm going to ask a couple of opening questions and then turn to the audience. So start preparing your questions, make them short, make them pointed, and don't give speeches, because that's not what we're here for. So if you'll allow me...
That's what I'm here for.
So you've done your bit, so we don't want the audience emulating as well, because we don't really have much time. Sure. Scotland and Europe. Now, I'm older than you. I'm old enough to remember the high point of Scottish integration into Europe, and that was Lisbon in 1967, when your football team, composed of people from within a 30-mile radius of Glasgow, beat the Galacticos of Inter Milan 2-1. And this was an extraordinary moment for me because I was living outside Scotland at the time and I was able to say, hey, look, this was great. However, Scotland and Europe is a delicate issue. You mentioned Ireland. Are there other exemplars of good economic structures that you would point to as being potentially models for Scotland to follow?
It's a really good question. You made me jealous by telling me you were around in 1967. Celtic, by the way, is the football team, for those that don't know, became the first UK club to ever win a European major title. So just so you know that, record that, and make sure you never forget that fact, I think is incredibly important.
And he's a supporter of Celtic.
And I'm, of course, a supporter of Celtic. So I think there's actually models that are within the European Union, and even those countries that aren't necessarily within the European Union, that are great exemplars for Scotland when I look at countries of our size, and I look at countries that are European countries. So I think about countries like Norway, like Austria, like Denmark, like Ireland that I mentioned already. And if we take each of those countries, they have a higher national income per head, they have higher levels of productivity and lower levels of inequality. I suppose the central argument I have, and we can get into the granular detail of independence, always happy to of course do that, but at a high level, I would look at those countries that have a population not dissimilar to the size of Scotland, have many of the natural resources that Scotland has, but Scotland has not only oil and gas, not only renewable energy, not only world-class food and drink, world-class universities, life sciences, so on and so forth. With all that incredible resource and all of that human talent, then why not Scotland? Why not Scotland? And for me, the argument is becoming stronger by the day because there was a feeling in 2014 that one of the strengths of the argument for those who opposed independence was the broad shoulders of the UK's economy. Those broad shoulders have not just become hunched. I would suggest that there's been a complete and utter collapse in the UK's global reputation for a stable economy.
Right, but First Minister, you're drifting back into saying making the case for independence. But what I would like to push you on is if we allow the independence were to happen, I'd say the signs at the moment are not so promising for that after the events of the last 2 or 3 years. How easy is it going to be for Scotland to re-enter the European Union? And bear in mind in this context that there is a long queue, Ukraine, Western Balkans, Moldova, even Georgia. They're in the queue already. Scotland is not. On the assumption of independence, how easy would it be for Scotland to re-enter the European Union, and where would it be in the queue?
Yeah, so first of all, you'll be an expert, so you'll know that, of course, the queue, you don't work through it in terms of who's been there the longest in terms of the queue. The queue is done on merit. In Scotland, of course, member of the European Union for many decades. We comply with the acquis communautaire. We do our best, even though we're outside of the European Union, to make sure that we align to EU standards as best as we possibly can. The truth be told, and we've been very honest about this in our white papers, the series that I spoke about in the speech, that we completely accept, fully accept, that there would have to be an EU accession process, probably through the usual articles. We would have that accession process that we would have to comply with. But Scotland is in quite a unique position. There's not another country that has been part of the European Union for so long, taken out of the European Union and then wishes to rejoin. So we would accept that there has to be a process. I couldn't give you a time. You're asking, how long would it take? That would be a discussion and a negotiation between the European Union and Scotland. I go back to what Donald Tusk said. He's now, of course, the Prime Minister of Poland, but in his previous position in the European Union, he said that when asked about the question about Scotland and rejoining the European Union, he said there would be great enthusiasm in Brussels for it. And why would there not be, given everything we can contribute? I would hope also that we would benefit from as part of the European Union.
So you're optimistic on that?
I'm always optimistic.
I think it'd be interesting, though, for the audience if you were to give even an indicative 5 years, 10 years, 20 years.
Look, every journalist that's sitting in the back row has tried that with me and they've not managed to get anywhere, because the reason for that is that it would just be me plucking a figure out the air. The negotiation would have to happen with the European Union. We accept it as an accession process. We accept we'd have to go through that. So nobody talks about automatic EU membership. There's an accession process we'd have to go through. And we'd have to have that discussion with partners in the European Union. So I'm not going to insult them by saying, look, Scotland demands to be in within a year. No, we'd have to have that discussion and negotiation with the European Union.
Right. Let's turn to the audience. So what I want to do is to take questions in groups of 3 to have as many different opinions, and you can see this is already a very diverse audience. Indeed. So let me start with you there. I'm not allowed to say you're a woman, by the way. I just have to assume it. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you, First Minister, for the amazing speech. I wanted to ask...
Tell us briefly who you are.
I'm an alumna of the EI. My name is Zarin, and I'm just coming back for this talk. I'll be very quick. I kind of wanted to talk about the social cultural union between England and Scotland that you mentioned. We're actually working on a project right now funded by the National Lottery to harness communities' connection to then work on social causes. And as you know, and you've indicated that the UK government has been cutting a lot of funding for charities and whatnot. Could you comment on what your government is doing for charities and VCS sectors in Scotland? Thank you.
And just to be convenient, immediately behind you there are two more questions.
Thanks, First Minister. I'm an Irish political economy student, so you've alluded quite a few times to Ireland and how you think it's a kind of appropriate comparison to make for Scotland's future development. But could you talk maybe a little bit more about how you think you could work with Ireland in the future? So both outside the EU and then, well, if EU membership were to ever happen, what kind of partnership do you foresee with Ireland in the future?
Have you? Right.
What was your name?
Evan.
Evan.
Go ahead.
Hi, First Minister. Thank you so much for a great speech. My name is Ojas. I'm an undergrad at LSE. I was wondering, given the Westminster consensus you highlighted and challenged so strongly, would you ever consider running for the Prime Minister of the UK?
Ha! Can you see my political advisors? I have to say, I get a fair number of messages like that, particularly in relation to the situation in Gaza over the last few months. So the SNP won't be standing any candidates, I have to say, in England, despite some people's desire, perhaps, to see that. Let me go back to the other two questions. Forgive me if I didn't catch your name. Was it Darren? The first question. Darren. Dazin? Because I don't like to get people's name wrong. People pronounce my name wrong all the time. Zarin, thank you. So yeah, I've been called. I was recently called hummus by somebody, which was quite something.
Well, chickpea.
So, look, to me, the social contract with the people of Scotland is incredibly important. That doesn't mean that we don't face challenges in Scotland. I'm presenting to you a picture of what I think is a better future. In the meantime, we're having to deal with the fiscal reality, which is that our budget has been cut, for example, by £500 million in resource in real terms over the last 2 years by the UK government. I wish I could tell you that £500 million in a resource cut won't have an implication. Of course it does. So we've had to make some difficult decisions. But what we try to do is support our third sector because they are worth their weight in gold. We saw that during the pandemic. We see it to this very day when it comes to dealing with some incredible challenges that we face, whether it's tackling child poverty, tackling issues around delayed discharge, for example, the excellent work that the British Red Cross does. We try our best to try to support the third sector, work with the third sector and work with communities where we can. Again, that doesn't mean that there hasn't been challenging budget discussions, but our ethos has been our social contract with the people. And if I just give you another example of that where I can, despite the really challenging budget position, that's why we took a really tough decision in our budget for 24-25 to increase tax for the top 5% earners. That's not an easy thing to do in an election year, by the way, to whether it's for the top 5 or any percentage, to increase tax. But we did that because we wanted to make sure that everybody could benefit from free university education, from free childcare, from not paying a single penny for your prescription charges, for free bus travel for everybody who's aged under 22 or over 60, or if you've got a disability. For being able to target measures like the Scottish Child Payment, which by the latest modelling shows that an estimated 100,000 children could be lifted out of poverty in Scotland. So that's the social contract by which we try to maintain. It doesn't mean we get everything right by any stretch of the imagination. Evan's question on Ireland. Look, Ireland is going to always be an extremely close ally, whether we're part of the United Kingdom or indeed independent. We have good relationships with Ireland, ones that we want to continue to strengthen, but we'd like to do that as equal partners, not as part of the UK, but actually as an independent nation in its own right. And we engage just now with Ireland through, for example, the British-Irish Council. I'd love that to be the British-Irish-Scottish Council in years to come. There's many areas that we can work closely on. Some of those on trying to find shared solutions to shared problems. So I don't need to tell you or anybody, I suspect, that Ireland is facing some significant challenges in Dublin around housing, especially. Now, in Scotland, we also face some housing challenges. Of that, there's no doubt. We've had to make really difficult decisions around our own housing budget recently. So how do we get shared solutions, modern methods of construction, looking at modular construction? How do we put our heads together to work on common solutions to common challenges? And then there's areas of, I think one of the biggest areas of collaboration with Ireland will undoubtedly be on the renewable energy piece. Scotland and Ireland, probably alongside Norway, could effectively be the solution to the European Union and European countries, other European countries' problems and challenges around its over-reliance on foreign imports of gas, particularly Russian gas. But I think Ireland and Scotland collaborating together on that is a great idea. And I think I've already answered the last question by saying thank you for the flattery, but I'm fine trying to ensure that Scotland becomes an independent country. We've got plenty of election contests in Scotland, let alone making any intervention south of the border. Thank you.
All right, let's go upstairs. Two right at the back there. Right, where you are, the striped, whatever it is.
Thank you, First Minister, for being here. I'm Max Gucci, doing a Development Studies Masters. My question is, are there not parallels between your nationalist push for independence and the nationalist arguments made for Brexit? I know that connected to independence is the idea of rejoining the EU, but firstly, how practical is that really, especially seeing the example of Northern Ireland? And is this idea not just playing on the hopes, emotions, and skewed facts as the original Brexiteers did? Thank you.
Very good question.
Yeah, there's another one right there. I can't see you.
Hi, I'm Callum, a student at the neighbouring King's College London, and I wanted to ask, you've spoken about your close relationship with Anna Sawar, and of course there's an ideological overlap between the Labour Party and the SNP. But given recent events in Parliament with the ceasefire vote, it seems that those relations are a little bit strained at the moment. And I wanted to ask, going into an election year, where does the SNP stand on working with the Labour Party to get the Conservatives out of power?
Any more women, or people identifying as women wanting to ask questions? How about in the middle here? Downstairs. Yes, you go ahead, please.
Simcom, thank you for your speech. It was very insightful. I wanted to ask, I work for the civil service and I'm a postgraduate student from SOAS.
Speak right into the microphone so we can hear you.
My question to you is, I attended a panel event in my workplace on artificial intelligence, and they were saying they'll use artificial intelligence to predict when the economy will crash and when there will be a further recession, like escalating even further. What steps do you think can be undertaken to boost the British economy?
Yeah. I could do a speech on that alone.
Okay,
so I take those three?
We'll take these three. Just so you know that the First Minister and Anna Sawar are both Hutchie boys.
We are,
you
yes,
have to explain what a Hutchie boy is.
Yeah, we went to the same school, though I should say that he was 2 years older than me, so and remains the case. Let me take the first question. I thought it was an excellent question. I didn't catch your name, forgive me. Max. So an excellent question from Max. So the big differences for me actually, there's a number of differences. First and foremost, it's really important that those who believe in independence, like I do, continue to approach the debate with honesty. So what you won't hear from me is, by the way, Max, we'll be independent tomorrow and there'll be a river of milk and honey, and by the way, we'll put £350 million on the side of a bus and we'll tell you you'll get that back every single week. Right? What we will do is we will be evidence-based and facts-based, and equally be upfront about where the challenges are. So, for example, Scotland will face a deficit that we'll have to try to bring down. So we'll have to work within make sure we're fiscally sustainable in that regard. We'll have to be really upfront about some of the points you've already made around if we're in the European Union and the UK remains outside of the European Union, what does that mean around, for example, custom checks for goods? And we've talked about that in a recent paper as part of the series that I've mentioned already. But what we'll also be honest about is the massive opportunity that if Scotland had access to its oil and gas revenues, was able to, of course, unleash the potential of the net zero economy, particularly offshore wind, where we have massive potential, and we were able to carve our own path and our own future, then here's what we could achieve and could do. So we're not trying to appeal to people's emotions. We're trying to, and there's nothing wrong with doing that actually to some extent. But what we're trying to do is absolutely appeal to the evidence base. And I think those things that we were promised in 2014, we were promised if you vote no to independence, that's the only way to guarantee your membership of the European Union. And then what happened 2 years later? We were told, by the way, if you vote for opposing independence and for continued Westminster rule, then you'd have the broad shoulders of the EU's economy and the UK's global influence. And look how those things have fallen apart. And we were told, when we warned, by the way, one day Boris Johnson might be Prime Minister, they said, whoa, complete and utter scare stories from those who believe in independence, and look where we ended up being. So, look, we'll do our best to always stick to the evidence basis. And at the same time, those emotional connections that people have to the United Kingdom, never downplaying them. That important connection that people have who feel British, for example, who live in Scotland, we shouldn't ever downplay that. We should say, you know what, you can absolutely feel British and still vote for independence. Because what we're not telling you to do is rip up that cultural and social union. What we're saying is it not better that we make decisions for ourselves and meet the needs and interests of the country and make those decisions in Scotland, as opposed to a country so many hundreds of miles away where Scotland often feels like a bit of an afterthought. On Cam's question on the ceasefire vote, I think you referenced Anna Sauer. Look, Anna Sauer and I have lots of heated exchange, and suspect every Thursday at First Minister's Questions. That's me falling into your trap, Prime Minister's Questions. First Minister's Questions, you'll see a level of that robust exchange. What I try not to do in my politics is get extremely personal about politics, because I think it just then becomes a kind of really nasty, toxic culture, as I was being asked about earlier on. So with Anna Sauer and I, we have our differences. We'll be robust in those exchanges, but I'll do my best never to indulge into the personal side of it. I'll do my best. I'll always be able to meet that high expectation, but I always try to do my best in that regard. In terms of the question around the ceasefire, I have to this day been unable to understand Labour's reticence and hesitation in calling for an immediate ceasefire. I think the inability of the world community, for those who have opposed the ceasefire, to continue on that path in the face of such death and such destruction is frankly unforgivable. I cannot understand anybody who sees the emaciation, devastation, destruction, malnourishment of children can do anything other than call for an immediate ceasefire. Now, notwithstanding that, your question was, would I work with the Labour Party to get rid of the Conservatives? I'll work with virtually any political party to see the back of the Conservatives, certainly any party that is not on the right or far right, to get rid of the Conservatives. I don't think necessarily that there'll be any question of a need for a formal cooperation agreement with the Labour Party, because I suspect, as polls indicate, Keir Starmer will win and win big. What I would say, though, to Keir Starmer is work with the Scottish Government where it's in the mutual interest to do so. So I wrote to Keir Starmer at the end of January. I said, look, let's talk about tackling child poverty, such as scrapping the 2-child limit, scrapping the rape clause, scrapping the bedroom tax. Let's talk about these things. And let's also talk about renewables and how we boost Scotland's renewable potential. And let's talk about the Constitution, where we've got in a disagreement, but let's have that conversation. And I have to say, I've still not had the courtesy of even acknowledgement, let alone a response. So it doesn't fill me with great hope that there's going to be much in the way of, well, certainly before an election, much in the way of collaboration with the Labour Party, but I'd be willing to do so on issues of domestic and international importance. Well, the final question around what would you do, different in terms of the UK economy. There's a number of things. Obviously, I've mentioned the fact that I'd like the UK to rejoin the European Union, not the single market. there's even things they could do that are shy of that, and for example, signing a veterinary agreement, which would mean only 1 to 2% of agri-goods would probably need checked. That could have a massive boost for the Scottish, or could have a boost for the Scottish economy, potentially. Migration policy is the other one. I think migration policy of the UK is fundamentally flawed. We have the working age demographic going in the wrong direction. We have workforce vacancies across the private and public sector. And yet we have a migration, and we have countries across the world who have a young population where their first destination of choice is the United Kingdom, and yet the hostile environment we've created means we're losing that talent to Canada, the United States and other European countries. So I would certainly do more in terms of migration, I would certainly do more in terms of course, our partnership with the European Union, and I would use our tax levers to make sure that we can be more competitive in areas of competitive advantage for Scotland. I would like us to explore how the UK government might be able to use its tax levers in order to incentivise investment into these areas of competitive advantage.
We only have a couple of minutes in theory. Do you mind taking another round?
Sure.
We had one question online, I believe. Microphone here, please. And then you in blue afterwards.
Question from Frank
Person
Curtis.
behind you.
Labour is now ahead of the SNP in the latest Scottish opinion polls. Will the SNP overtake Labour?
The answer to that is probably yes from your point of view.
Well, yes. But it's also not correct.
And in front of you first.
Hi, my name's Axel. I'm a master's student in public policy. And my question is, so I was just wondering what will be the future of the SNP once independence is achieved, and how will it reshuffle the political landscape in Scotland? Because I assume the Conservative and Labour will not be there anymore, so what will happen?
And it's straight behind you.
Question.
Hi, my name's Phil. I'm a master's student from Edinburgh. So I was going to ask, you mentioned the Constitution. Obviously, with the Supreme Court ruling it unconstitutional for another referendum, and with it looking like Labour might make some major gains, what do you consider a call from the Scottish people for a second referendum rather than other policy priorities?
That's a really good question.
Just one last question here, and then we have to wrap it up. So can you bring the microphone to the front, please? 3 becomes 4. Just here.
Hi, First Minister. It's Mark Paul from the Irish Times. You mentioned Ireland a lot, and a lot of Ireland's economic success is based on having the lowest corporate taxes in the Western world. Would an independent Scotland then, if Ireland is the model, would an independent Scotland slash your corporate tax rates? Is that how you would compete?
Good question. Right, I'll come to all of those. Is that fine? Sure, take it forward? Right, great. So I should say on the online question, in the latest poll, Labour are not ahead. In fact, in the latest poll, not only is the SNP ahead, but it's managed to widen the gap as well. But look, that's not to underplay the fact that Labour are going to be our significant challengers in this election, so we're not complacent about it whatsoever. I think for me, the more and more people are exposed to the lack of policy substance that's coming from Keir Starmer, the more and more people will begin to see through what I think this change message is from Labour. I don't think they present a real alternative. Everybody wants to see the back of the Conservatives. Of that, there's no doubt, and we will see the back of the Conservatives. But Keir Starmer doesn't need Scotland to win, but Scotland definitely, I would argue, needs SNP MPs to continue to stand up for Scotland. Because the only way that Scotland's voice is going to be heard is if you have SNP MPs. And Stephen Flynn and the team of at Westminster have shown that in recent weeks when it's come to various different votes. For example, the vote pushing for another vote on a ceasefire in Gaza is just another example. An excellent question about the future of the SNP and other political parties post-independence. Look, I think the SNP as a party is the biggest party of independence, the main vehicle of independence. Post-independence will undoubtedly still continue to be the major political party in Scotland. I don't know what the position will be of the Conservative and Unionist Party post-independence, or Labour Party for that matter. But it's really healthy, of course it is, almost goes without saying, really healthy to have a plurality of political parties of different opinions and different political traditions. So I think those parties will, in some way or another, continue, and there'll probably be new parties that will form and emerge as well. I suppose the point I'd make also is that upon a successful vote for independence, this maybe goes back to Max's question slightly, is one of the things I would be very keen for the SNP to do and the Scottish Government to do upon winning a referendum is making sure that we bring people who voted no and voted opposed independence as part of the team to help us to negotiate with the UK government. I think that's really important, and I think that's a mistake that was made by those who pursued Brexit. I think Brexit was a mistake, of course I do, but once the vote happened, the UK government at the time pushed for a hard Brexit, when actually what they could have done was bring those who opposed Brexit as part of a kind of Team UK approach to see how we negotiate with the European Union. I think that we should, in essence, the day after independence, bring those who opposed independence as part of, and say, look, we're now part of Team Scotland. We respect the vote of the people of Scotland. We're now part of Team Scotland. Let's go and let's advise those who are negotiating with the UK government. On Phil's point around the Constitution, there's as you say, a Supreme Court judgment. I think your question was where in the kind of priorities is independence. For me, it's absolutely linked with every single one of the priorities that people tell me about on the doorstep. So when I go to a doorstep, probably the first issue that people talk to me about is high energy bills and the cost of living crisis. Those kind of two issues are the top two issues that come to mind. And what I always say to people is those two issues are inextricably linked with the issue of independence. I mean, we are suffering a cost of living crisis that is not of our making. That disastrous budget from Kwasi Kwarteng, from Liz Truss, heaped upon 14 years of austerity, heaped upon by a damaging Brexit, these are not of Scotland's making, inextricably linked to independence, as are energy prices. And Scotland, a country that is so energy rich, but is fuel poor, to me is perverse. And so all these issues for me, it's about making sure that the link to independence is there. So despite the challenges in the question that was asked a moment ago, that the SNP has had, and we've had challenges, no doubt like any political party, over 17 years in government. But despite the challenges we've had, support for independence is rock solid. It's at 50%, or even by some polls recently higher than 50%. It's absolutely rock solid. In terms of the Irish Times, look, there's some areas that we'd look to see where Ireland has had success and seek to where we can have success. In terms of taxation, I'd point you towards the report by Sir Tom Hunter, the Hunter Foundation report that was released a number of months ago, where there was an idea that at least is worthy of exploration, which is looking at, for example, taxation around areas of competitive advantage for Scotland, which would include, for example, a renewables sector. So look, we'll chart our own path, we'll carve our own way, but we'll certainly look towards other European countries, Ireland certainly one of them, as I've said, Norway, Denmark, Austria, others, to say, look, where can we seek good ideas, but where can we also, as I say, chart our own course and our own path towards economic success.
And would that include low corporate taxation?
Well, again, as I said, we would certainly look to where we can be competitive around taxation, but I certainly won't write what the perspectives would be on day one in terms of taxation policy, but I would just urge everybody actually to look at the Hunter Foundation report, which I think makes some suggestions that are definitely worthy of exploration.
Okay, I regret our time is up, as Fiona Bruce sometimes says on question time. However, First Minister, you are to be blessed with an LSE bag.
Thank you very much.
And the leaders of governments get to have...
Wow, an LSE cap. Oh, very good. Thank you very much. I will not try this on only because I'm so vain that I have another meeting that I have to go to and this would ruin my hair. So,
we're not sure. Can we let him out of the room without putting it on?
Okay, fine. Well, I noted in the room Nelson Mandela wore it far more stylishly than I ever could. Let me also provide you with a small gift as a token of our appreciation for hosting me today. This is a quake. It's called a cup of friendship, whereby you can put in any drink you want. In my case, it's usually Iron Brew, and you then pass it to the next person. It's not the most COVID-friendly of utensils, but it certainly makes for a good friendship tool for enhancing friendship. So I hope you'll take it in that spirit.
Thank you very much. And I think Those of us who are not good Muslims will put whiskey in it, and that would sanitise anything.
Yes.
Right.
I can't drink out of that cup until 6:05, I'm afraid, because of Ramadan. But
right. Would you mind staying in your seats until the First Minister has left for security reasons? Because, as you know, there have been a lot of demonstrations around today. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking him for a very interesting and lively session.
Thank you. Thank you.